I mean, the first question is really about your personal experience in China. And I know you've been in China for the past 25 years. And you have really seen the Deng Xiaoping 改革开放 reforms with your own eyes, if you will. And I've written a book about it, which I read about 2 nights ago, parts of it anyway. I was wondering how you personally perceive these changes in China. You go back to the phase 1. This is phase 2 now. And did the business community know how far-reaching the changes would be when Beijing started to first tinker with the economy? And what was the atmosphere like, just as a business person who was there when the Deng Xiaoping and 改革开放 reforms were first instituted? I mean, you can really go anywhere with this question.
No, I think back when you first came to Beijing in the early 80s, it was a friend of mine called it, Beijing was big on dim. That you would find one street light, one street light, one street light, and there was a lot of darkness. And now, of course, the city is blazing. Shanghai and Guangzhou are all like that. I think the city in China has changed, and with the city's changed, also the people living in the city have changed, and that's the biggest changes. So I don't think that was entirely predictable. I think what was predictable was the energy and enthusiasm of the Chinese people for economic development. That after 30 years of waiting, that finally they were getting a chance to make their own decisions about where to work and how to work. And that opportunity, I think, most people could have said something would happen. We saw it in the countryside when the communes were abolished and sideline farming came in. And then in the cities, as soon as the cities were able to retain more of their own wealth, and we saw it in Shanghai first, and then the special economic zones, then we started to see real social and economic change. That was predictable. What wasn't predictable was, I think, the changes in society that we are starting to see now. I think that the technology, of course, is new. Many of the ways that technology creates new opportunities for people to converse, creates new jobs, creates new culture. All these things were not predictable. We didn't know. And ultimately, I think what may not have been entirely thought through was the migration of country to city, that this would be something that would not only change China economically, but will change it socially, and change it in a way which it had never experienced in 4,000 years of cultural history. So that part, I think, is genuinely an unknown today and will be in the future.
I mean, it is, when I read some of the contemporary histories in China of the Deng era and when the reforms were first instituted, there's a lot of skepticism among contemporary historians, contemporary observers, and I read some of the East German documents and German documents looking at China in the 80s and mid-80s, and it's very skeptical of where China can take these things if these things are too ambitious. Now, was the business community equally skeptical, or were they more optimistic about where Deng could take these reforms into the future?
Well, no, I think the business community was quite skeptical, and it was very narrowly focused. And if you look at, there were 4 special economic zones in the beginning, and only one of them worked. It was only Shenzhen on the border. That was because it was down to the local Hong Kong people who just moved their stuff a little bit over the border because it was cheaper. Right. And then you had Hukou and China Merchants and a few others that created some local investment, but it was a lot of other places still didn't take off. The Zhuhai, for example. So it's clear that it was selective, and for the foreign community, they very much wanted China to prove that it was a good deal. Yeah. So most of the early foreign investments came only after the Chinese government essentially paid for them, saying that if you bring this here, we promise we will make your market attractive. We will buy all your stuff. Mm-hmm. And that was the deal that went in automotive and in telecom equipment and any of the other industries where China attracted foreign investment initially. So, yeah, a lot of skepticism. And that's why I think the Communist Party's approach of seeking truth from facts and being fact-based about the whole thing was the only approach that would work, because anything else was going to run into a lot of skepticism. People wouldn't believe the promises.
As the co-chair of the Urban China Initiative at Tsinghua University, you alluded to some of the things you're dealing with in your talk just now. Specifically, I would like to get your opinion on the Hukou reforms. And as an area of debate in China, as you know, and does China need to abandon the Hukou system in the future, or do you see a more of a transitional Hukou system being the way forward to ensure that there's not free movement between, migrant workers coming from the countryside into the eastern coastal cities?
Well, the Hukou has served different purposes. One is to keep track of people. Another is to give them access to benefits. A third is to register their land. And all these are different purposes. So I think as documentation, it's important to have. That without the documentation, one cannot assign a claim or have own property or be registered for anything. So but the question of entitlement, that's the issue. And I don't know what the best model is. I think that's the process China's going through right now, is just saying, should we tell somebody that if they're a rural resident, they have to give up their land, then in exchange for that, they get to have access to urban services? Or do we say, no, you can retain your land, but then you only get a certain level of access to service, not as much as everybody else?
Yeah.
I think there's genuine, debate about what's the right option for China, because the market ultimately isn't very efficient. This is not something one can put a market value on in so many ways, because there's long-term decisions. You're dealing with not only a person, but their family and the whole village as well. So I don't see an easy answer to this. I do think that the cities will probably have different solutions. I don't think that the answer for Shanghai will be the same answers for Guangxi or Shanxi. Why should it be? There's just too much of a difference.
So there should be regional reform according to local conditions, you say?
Yeah, similar to healthcare. If we look at healthcare pilots in China, they're being done at the city level. So I think that's the moment.
That's fair. If I could just ask a follow-up to that, we sometimes hear the argument that China needs to sustain double-digit economic growth so that peasant workers have jobs in the major urban centers, and claims that if growth were to fall, there will be peasant worker unrest, which would create major political problems in Beijing. Do you see this as a likely scenario as China's growth maybe dips in the next decade, or do you see Beijing coming up with alternate solutions to this?
I don't think the double-digit growth is the critical factor. I think the problem that China has is employment. I don't think the economy creates jobs. I think that's because too much money goes to heavy industry. Heavy industry is capital intensive, it's not labor intensive. It's going to heavy industry because there is no return to a banker to give money to a service entrepreneur. Most service sectors are run by small and medium-sized enterprises. They're private, so they are riskier, and a banker will not lend money to a riskier company. So that's the reason we don't have jobs, is that the services create jobs, and the services are not getting money. If double-digit growth was the only way, then we would wind up overbuilding so much heavy industry. We create mountains of cement and steel, and start to look like the Soviet Union. That's clearly not the answer. We've got to restructure the financial system so that money goes to the service sector in order to create those jobs. Otherwise, yes, we have a huge problem, because 150 million people are employed in construction in China right now. That's just too much. We don't need 150 million people in construction. That engine will ultimately eat China if we allow it to go uncontrolled. And so there is some time pressure on this.
Okay. China has come up with its 12th five-year plan. It's outlined some key investments in strategic industries, education, financial services, healthcare, and logistics that are increasingly regulated. For opening the market to foreign companies, has this prompted more foreign companies to enter the Chinese market and expand their operations? And has this reflected in McKinsey's client engagements in China?
Well, foreign companies are always looking at China. I don't know of a company globally that doesn't have some kind of a China strategy. And the timing of their entries depends on their view of the opportunity in the marketplace. I don't know that the 12th five-year plan has much to do with that. Market opening in China has been relatively limited since the WTO been a little bit, but not so much. People are interested in clean tech in particular, and the strategic industries that China has announced. But at this stage, as I said, most everybody is actually in China. There are very few companies that aren't here. So it's now about not being in it, but more about stepping up and making greater investments and trying to, as we say, making China your second home market. So that's the stage.
Just the last question, of course. This is a year of major leadership change in China. I mean, this is a very broad question. You can really go anywhere. How does the business community see the challenges or the forecasted path with leadership change in China? And are there challenges, or will China just continue on its path now?
Well, the business community's number one concern about China is policy discontinuities. They're concerned about regulations changing on them overnight.
Right.
And so as long as the new leadership pledges that it won't make major policy changes, they'll be quite happy with that. And I think that's where we are. I don't think the new leadership is planning on making any dramatic course corrections. This, of course, means that the leadership has to think carefully about what it does choose to change, and be a little bit more better at communicating when they think changes are needed. And so more of a two-way dialogue may give the business community more confidence in the leadership. Typically, it's been very one-way. All of a sudden, there's a new policy, and you have to adjust to it. So that because changes are necessary, it's not that we can't have the same policy always. But one hopes that the new leadership understands that they need to have more of a two-way conversation in making these policy changes.
Thank you so much, I mean, for taking the time to
Okay, sure.
share your views.
Okay.